Starfield is a game with many unreasonable expectations on it, many of them created by its own marketing team. But I want to set those expectations aside, because even free of those expectations, this game does many things very wrong. This doesn't mean I don't like the game, but it makes many mistakes, big and small, that make it, in my opinion, worse than other games by the studio. I've made this video to examine those flaws, because I would like the game to be better. And the only meaningful points of comparison I will use in the video are those previous games by the studio. There are undeniable severe problems. The game is by all means dated in its design and systems, buggy and unpolished in its functionality, and archaic in its user interface, accessibility, and customization, in such obvious ways that it took less than a week for modders to implement a better interface. Something so obviously improvable isn't a question of technical knowledge or limitations. It's a lack of understanding its players and terrible decision-making during its design and planning. A design that goes against some of the most important parts of what I associate with Bethesda games, but one that was necessary for the core conceit of the game to exist, that being the ability to explore an entire galaxy. I've seen very extreme takes on both sides. There are people raving about 10 out of 10 reviews, and then there are people saying that the game is hot garbage and one of the worst games ever made. The truth is never that extreme. I have done the best I can to remain unaffected by others' opinions, and to simply play the game and evaluate it. Many of my final observations are negative, and that is because despite enjoying the game on some occasions quite a lot, the feeling that grew over my playtime and stayed with me after it was one of disappointment. For as much as I enjoyed many things that Starfield does, my experience was soured by the things it does wrong, and even more by the things it doesn't. I want to truly look at the issues the game has, why they might exist, and what could have been done to remedy them, and what Elder Scrolls 6 will probably need to take into account, or any good in that game whenever it comes out will be completely overshadowed by the bad. Just as much, I do want to praise the things the game does right, and I will do that just very later on. So let's talk about everything wrong with Starfield. The first complaint I want to lodge at Starfield is the lack of a cohesive play space. Starfield feels disjointed, like a game with many different parts that never make a whole. You could broadly separate Starfield into 4 parts. Those would be questing, which would include talking to NPCs and persuasion and things like that, maintaining conversations that inform you of the conflicts that you're going to resolve. The second part would be action, which includes combat and all its aspects, from stealth and powers to some of the more light immersive sim aspects the game incorporates, but mainly the running around and shooting things. Then we have the space portion, with piloting your ship, entering combat, and jumping from planet to planet. And finally, the building aspect, centered around customizing your outposts and your ship. To me, Starfield fails at making these parts flow into one another, and in a more concrete sense, fails to entice the player with gameplay loops that remain consistently exciting throughout your spacefaring adventures. The biggest disconnect is that in Starfield's predecessors, the questing and action existed together within exploration, and now that has been replaced by that new space portion. Menus upon menus, fast travel after fast travel. In previous Bethesda titles, the experience of running around and encountering a scenario felt very organic. I say it felt because a lot is done to hint at interesting locations and events, but they use the fact that they know exactly where you will start to map out those interactions and open the world up in a spider web-like way. Exploring the world would lead you to new towns and have you run into characters that would point you in different directions. The questing and combat felt much more intertwined in general. The biggest impact is felt due to not having a set open world. In previous games by BGS, if I ever felt uninterested in a questline or felt like there was nothing cool for me to do, I knew that by just running in a direction where I didn't have any markers on my map, it would inevitably lead me to discovering exciting new locations and quests. This is effectively impossible to do in Starfield. You must rely on hoping that your active questlines guide you to new locations that will themselves guide you to more. If that chain is ever broken, and you don't feel like pursuing anything in your quest log, the experience that awaits is just terrible. Navigating the star map and slowly jumping from system to system, checking to see if any planet has the 3-dot marker, which indicates that it has some content to explore, is not fun. It's not engaging, and most importantly, it is a massive step down from setting that custom marker in Fallout and simply walking, stopping at anything that might draw your attention because it's right in front of you and you can walk up to it. I'm sure someone might tell me that I'm playing Starfield wrong. And while I'm sure that there are games that you can technically play wrong, I think very few of those games exist, and Starfield is not a game you can play wrong, because what I want from this game is something that previous Bethesda games have given me. There is no wrong way to play Fallout or Skyrim. That is the whole damn point of those games, that you can interact with them in whatever way you want, and the game will let you. If you want to ignore any systems in those games, you can. Settlements, weapon customization, magic, whatever it may be. But most importantly, if you wanted to ignore the main quest line, or any other for that matter, you could. Just head out exploring. I can't do that in Starfield, and that was always my favorite thing to do. The organic exploration is missing, replaced with engaging in the main quest or the 4 faction quest lines, which amount to little more than fast traveling from location to location and following the prompts. While main faction quests have always been where a large part of the content of these games is concentrated, there was a journey in reaching them, and the open world led you to discoveries no matter what quests you decided to undertake. The sense of wonder and exploration has been reduced in inverse proportion to the scope of the game world. A massive galaxy to explore, but without a sense of connection between it, it feels more like a glorified list of locations that's hard to access, since you have to waste your time jumping from system to system just to find out that there's nothing worth exploring. A lot of this has to do with how the game changes a very important part of the previous ones, the progression and pacing of the game, and how it relates to the big locations in them. In Starfield, New Atlantis, Aquila, Neon, The Key, and Sidonia, which are all a mere warp away. There is no slowly trekking across the land, interacting with what you encounter and getting lost in the world. There is no progression from small town to big cities. The experience of roaming the land and solving smaller problems on your way to reaching these big cities has a huge effect on pacing. Your adventure is no longer punctuated by these memorable moments of reaching these notable locations. Instead, all of them are introduced to you very quickly, making them feel like quest hubs instead of chapters in your story. In Skyrim, setting out to reach a major city always felt like the start of an adventure, where I would make my way there, and different quests and events could unfold during my trip. And once I reached it, there was an excitement around exploring these cities, since I knew I would be staying there for a while, solving all the quests I came across. In Fallout, the progression until reaching the main settlements feels like you're building up to them, getting your bearings and understanding the wider conflicts that exist in the world before approaching them head-on in the main areas of the game. In Starfield, this gameplay loop has been destroyed, because the loop can't exist in a game where travel is reduced to pressing 2 buttons on a menu and appearing at the location. This was always going to be an issue moving to a sci-fi spacefaring setting, but just how profound the impact of this change was something I didn't expect. Another issue that pops up and also affects the progression, and especially the late game, is the possibility of stumbling onto enemies or areas that are very difficult. In a game like Skyrim or the Fallouts, it was common to encounter enemies that were noticeably more difficult and a higher level than you, especially early on. Getting mauled by a Deathclaw early on into your Wasteland experience is a staple of the franchise, not even just Bethesda's iterations. These situations really spark a fire in me, and I think most players, to level up, gear up, and return prepared. The curiosity you feel when finding a high-level area crawling in enemies you simply can't deal with serves two purposes. The first is to make it clear that one of your long-term goals is to become powerful enough to then explore these areas that you know exist and are currently inaccessible. The second is to instill a sense of wonder and mystery that persists throughout your playthrough and grows each time you find another area like it. What could be waiting for me in that location? Quests, loot, maybe there's a whole new town waiting on the other side, a cool, unique dungeon or a mystical sword or a vault to explore. Then when you reach a point in your playthrough where you think you can take those challenges on, you have the option of stopping what you're doing and going back to explore these locations. These locations in themselves could be a one-and-done affair or could spiral into a rabbit hole of more questing and exploration. Starfield doesn't have this. By the time I encountered something that was truly difficult, it was so late into my playthrough and I had to go so far out of my way, slowly jumping from system to system to the very edge of the game world, that its effect was diminished almost to the point of not existing. This isn't something that would really be affected by difficulty selection either, since higher difficulties reward you with better loot, making a pseudo-scaling system that I don't much care for. Loot that, due to its randomized nature, sure might keep you looting, but also impacts the sense of progression, since, as happened to me, you can just consistently get really powerful weapons that trivialize combat, and most of the value of armor pieces come from their traits, which add convenience features like carry capacity or auto healing. And in general, the game is just very easy for many reasons, including AI, which I'll touch on later. And as a final note, I think the randomized loot here is even worse than it was in Fallout 4. Not being able to gently tease and guide the player when navigating the open world, knowing where they start and where they might head, and designing a world around interesting locations in all possible directions, and using those different tools like enemies to gate certain things and create mystery, makes Starfield feel less like you're writing your own story and more like you're navigating menus in order to select the next mission. This problem really started to rear its head once I had finished 3 of the faction quests, since I really didn't have anything on my plate except the main quest and the other remaining faction quest, which I didn't feel like doing at that time. I now felt like my options had become to engage with the content the game had put in front of me, to wander big cities hoping for some quest to pop up, or to slowly explore the galaxy in search for more things to do. What I craved for was that last option, something that Skyrim and Fallout had trained me to crave. But there is no comparing that exploration and what those games offer to the previously mentioned system we have in Starfield. The early game went well enough for me. Between 8 hours in to around 32, I had all of these quests worth doing, but as those were finished, this problem started to sting more and more. I personally play Bethesda games not only to tell my own story and see all of the different possible outcomes and interact with all of the different factions and NPCs, but for the wonderful discovery, for stumbling upon something truly surprising, something memorable, being a location and the story that it contains within, or different quest lines and how surprising or fun they can be. Once that possibility of encountering these wonderful things dries out and is substituted with procedurally generated identical mine number 5, or repeat this same Radiant quest where you go and shoot down a ship, these games lose a lot of their appeal for me. If I just wanted to repeat basic quests of take down bandits, I would do it in a game that plays better than this one. And that feeling of discovery is one of the most important parts that's missing in Starfield. There is nothing equivalent to finding a vault in Fallout. These dungeons that feel so special with their own story to tell. There really isn't anything to stumble upon. As I mentioned before, you're introduced to the 5 big cities that are the most impressive things in the game right off the bat. So everything you do after that leads you to places that are less impressive. If all you want to do is explore, hoping to find something special, you have to follow the quest markers that guide you to locations with content that the game recommends. Because if you simply go around exploring, you will encounter procedurally procedurally generated locations until you eventually recognize every single possibility that these have. There is no incentive to simply walk around and find things, mostly because it's not easy to walk around and find things. And if the fact that you will stumble upon repeated procedurally generated content isn't enough to disincentivize the randomly walking around planets, maybe the rewards you receive will, because while they can be cool and you can obtain some really good loot, that loot feels a lot less meaningful when it's not tied into your progression or your ability to reach newer, cooler zones. And don't worry, because if you're going to stick to the main questlines, I encountered the same identical abandoned mine back to back in main story questlines, so there is no escaping the procedurally generated content. Let me be clear. There are some good surprises and interesting locations in Starfield. They can be amazing, but they're amazing for Starfield. You never encounter anything as impressive as the average quality of surprise in previous games by Bethesda. There is no Vault 34, or whatever your favorite vault might be. Generally, if Starfield has something cool to show you, like the Red Mile or Paradiso in the Lost Colony ship, it will find a not-so-subtle way to guide you there. There are some great quests that, as far as I know, have no indicators to help you find them, but not many. Within the very design of Starfield, Bethesda has lost one of the things that made their games so special, and the fact that they didn't find a suitable substitute shows how the obsession with making a space game led to these sacrifices, or a fundamental misunderstanding of what their own games are good at. While it's possible to argue that previous Bethesda games also had these separations, the truth is that those transitions were much more tolerable thanks to that cohesive overworld. The moment the overworld becomes a fast travel list, much of the joy of jumping into a Bethesda game disappears. The first moment that the vault doors open, or that you exit the caves in Oblivion or Skyrim, have been exchanged for getting your ship, which functions as a mobile home base and has some cool ideas in customization, but that ultimately represents the boring list of locations that has taken away my beloved sense of adventure. These are just some of the biggest problems apparent in the very design of Starfield, but there are many more that exist throughout your moment-to-moment gameplay experience. For as much as the combat has improved and feels overall satisfying, at least the act of shooting guns, the AI leaves so much to be desired. And in my opinion, combat is only as fun as the enemies you take down. I would have put more effort into showing the worst examples of this, but the truth is that I don't need to cherry-pick situations. In every combat scenario, the AI fails to be engaging in combat. They will stand around like idiots, or react late to events, or glitch out. The enemies here feel like they would be passable in 2004, if that. Some people excuse this by saying that the game's shooter aspects are only one part of a game that does many things, but they are a huge primary part of the game. I'd argue the majority of this game is shooting things. I couldn't believe myself when taking notes, so I went back to Fallout 4 and found that AI to be better. My only explanation for this is that the added verticality and complexity in the maps of Starfield has hamstrung the AI to behave in these super simple, super boring ways. I do want to mention that towards the end of the main story quest, you encounter a type of enemy that is uninhibited. They can teleport wherever they want and have cool different powers that they can use in combat, and those are much more compelling combat encounters, but you get them for about 2 missions and that's it. I think that honestly makes it even worse. Much has been said about the constant loading screens, which for me on my PC never amounted to more than a couple of seconds, but they still felt very old and took me out of the experience. However, I dislike the idea that a game should not have loading screens in 2023. That isn't the issue. Loading screens don't equate to how good or bad a game is. God of War's long teleport walks are basically saved by dialogue, but there's nothing engaging in them, unlike maybe exposition in a Rockstar game while traveling, where you still participate in the open world. But God of War made a huge deal of its seamless one-take idea, despite the fact that these long walks feel like loading screens with dialogue on top. While not having a black screen pop up can help with immersion, at the end of the day, functionally, that's what these screens are. And if you substituted those long walks in God of War for a black screen with audio, the game would be just as amazing, not more and not less. I don't think that this is where the issue lies. I think the issue with Starfield is that there are considerably more loading screens than even in old Bethesda titles. The very way the game works with its planet hopping, ship entering, building mode, dungeon delving, fast traveling nature leads to there being many moments where you can encounter 4 or 5 loading screens back to back without anything important in each of them. These things would only happen in very specific, complex locations in previous games, such as the DC Mall, or the College of Winterhold in Skyrim, or the New Vegas Strip in New Vegas. This once again is a consequence of how the game just doesn't fit into Bethesda's engine and previous design ethos. So let's compare a typical travel interaction in any previous game by the studio, and one in Starfield. In a previous game, you might be inside a location to deliver a quest. Whether you want to fast travel or explore, you must now walk outside. That is one loading screen. If your next goal was exploration, there are no more loading screens until you enter a new location. If from there you wanted to go to a different location, that would be the worst case. You would have another loading screen as you fast travel there. And if you went to somewhere like the College of Winterhold, you would then have to walk into the college for a third loading screen, and then you would have a fourth loading screen if you were going to a separate part within the College of Winterhold. This is not only rare, but in the case of Starfield, you don't have that first option of, well, now you're outside, go explore things. You are now back at square one. Now on screen, I'm going to place you 2 examples for Starfield. They both start at a very common location for the Crimson Fleet questline, which made me very angry. So the first one would be that you are delivering a quest inside the quest area that you will find in the key. To leave, you have one loading screen. After you do this, you have to walk back to your ship and enter it, which would be your second loading screen. And now that you're on your ship, you have to undock with a little cinematic, which would be your third loading screen, no matter what. After this is done, I'm going to show you 2 different options, one for going to a planet and one for actually going to another space station. But for the space station one, you would actually then jump to the space and you could count waiting for your grav drive to rev up, especially when you are not in combat, as another loading screen. And then after you jump, you have to fly to that new space station and choose to dock, which would be another loading screen. That would be your 5th loading screen. And then once you are docked, you have to choose to get out of your ship and board that vessel, which is now your 6th loading screen. And if you needed to access another location on that ship, that would be your 7th loading screen. And it's not much better if you're landing on planets. I really want to emphasize how much this hurts the questing experience if you are going from objective to objective. If you're just going from one place to another to speak to somebody, you're going to encounter all of these loading screens and all of the meaningless fluff between them all of the time. And you could say that it's immersive, that you are doing all of this to travel through space, but there is nothing to do during that immersive period that's also broken up by constant loading screens. I do want to take a brief moment and ask that if you are enjoying this video so far, please consider subscribing and hitting the like button. This makes it so that this video reaches more people and that all of my future videos are sent directly to you, especially if you hit the notification bell as well. Thank you for watching so far, and let's continue. When it comes to other things that somehow never improve, the UI in Starfield is archaic, cumbersome, and terribly explained. The fact that we need videos with titles like 15 secret amazing things Starfield doesn't tell you to find out that we can transfer inventory from our ship's cargo outside our ship if we're in range of it is proof of this. That could be clearly laid out to the player. We should have more ways to sort through loot and manage it as well, and better ways of knowing the stats and uses of the things we have. All of this is so obviously terrible that it took 3 days for modders to release Star UI, which overhauls the entire system to do just that, and even adds indicators showing from where to where you're transferring items when dealing with your ship and vendors. It's truly beyond me that at this stage, Bethesda releases a game like this with such gaping holes in its functionality that are solved by modders in no time at all. They either expect modders to fix it, or are truly that dumb. The biggest offense is that many people on Xbox, or who don't want to get into modding, have to live with an inferior system. I understand some people don't want something like Star UI, but there is no harm in adding an option similar to it for players to toggle or customize right out the box. But no, they're fine releasing a game with an inventory and UI that is barely, and I mean barely, passable and not enjoyable to use. Another thing that changes, but only a little, are glitches, because glitches abound. But I don't want to spend more time harping on something that everybody on the internet has already spoken about. Enemies and NPCs will phase through walls and ceilings. Questlines can break, although they are being patched. Items can fly, ragdolls can permanently get stuck doing the source engine shuffle, but honestly, less so than in other BGS games at launch. So, points there, I guess. Something that very dramatically harms the game is the robotic, scripted nature of the world and the NPCs. The way NPCs snap into place after dialogue to proceed with their conga line of existence makes me question if I'm exploring the Milky Way or living in the worst possible version of the Matrix every time that it happens. Their soulless eyes, paired with programmed emotions in their faces, all blanketed by an inconsistent cavalcade of voice performances, which range from excellent all the way to who let the janitor voice this NPC. And this leads to the worst type of Uncanny Valley. I normally spend most of my time reading subtitles in these sorts of games, but if I ever looked up to see their faces, I would immediately be suspect of whatever that character was saying, since they had so obviously lost the will to live, yet communicated in such a chipper, upbeat, and expressive manner. I am an eternal optimist, and while when necessary, I can pick apart something in order to criticize it, I believe that if I have to stretch to do so, it's not that fair of a criticism. Many things have been said about how Starfield breaks people's immersion, and many of those are overblown and only exist to those actively looking for those complaints instead of those truly trying to enjoy the game. But this is an area where they are not overblown. Having Andrea explain in detail to me the horrors of her past and how she questions her beliefs while she slowly glides away from me, facing a wall and going out of focus, ruins my experience and would ruin anyone's. Sure, it made me laugh a whole lot, but I'm sure I would have enjoyed this more if that hadn't happened. I genuinely ended up in the final confrontation with the main antagonist of the game, and the camera glitched out so that I could view this conversation from the perspective of inside their head. And don't worry, it's not a spoiler, I blurred out the name, but like, this is real. This happened. It's ridiculous. I already spoke on how easy the game is, and that impacts more things than looking forward to gaining power throughout your adventure. The difficulty affects the process of leveling up as well. The new ability tree focuses on leveling up several ranks in each tier of each tree, and then unlocking the next tier. This allows you to progress further down, requiring a certain amount of total investment in the tree before being allowed to continue. Some things that you might expect to be available right out of the box are not actually available because now they are skills. Things like stealth, pickpocketing, your new booster pack, lockpicking, or the ability to target specific parts of a ship in combat are all locked behind skills. On one hand, I think this is interesting because it adds a wrinkle to role-playing, but on the other hand, these are some really essential parts of the game that are disproportionately useful compared to others, especially when dealing with main objectives in quests. Unless you mod out encumbrance, you'll probably also invest in weightlifting to carry more stuff and not be encumbered. You'll probably invest in those skills I just mentioned before, and if you're like me, you'll invest in research to mod your weapons and suits and do stuff with outposts. If you like the shipbuilding, you'll put points into piloting so that you can get a C-class license and have a nicer ship. Even if you consider some of these things core parts of the game that are locked behind these skills, there's still plenty of space for expression and specialization, but a lot of important things are locked out if you don't invest at least 6 to 7 levels. This is where that difficulty comes in, because your combat skill tree is useful, but towards the end of my time with the game, where I had saved up about 12 points from analysis paralysis, I tested different trees out, and maxed out my scoped rifle damage following the combat tree all the way down. It was fun to one-shot everything, but it also made combat trivial. Things died in 3 shots before, and now they die in 1. So why am I investing in this? This is not an issue exclusive to Starfield. A lot of this balancing is just as bad in Bethesda's other games. But it should be fixed by now, and make them feel important and like things that define your playstyle, and not something that makes you overpowered. Because some things, like melee and unarmed, require skills to function much like before, and things like ballistics are already too strong, and you can make them overpowered. But at the end of the day, because the game is so easy, you don't need to invest anything in the combat tree if you just want to shoot things, and you can go and invest in all of the other ones. Because compared to now your guns do more damage, the other skills unlock huge portions of the game. Like going deeper into shipbuilding and customization, or going deep into research will unlock many options for your outposts. I regret going down the weapon and suit mods route because I kept finding weapons and armor that were so strong I didn't feel the need to engage with the system and mod out my weapons. I did some of it for the fun of it, but after researching and modding weapons for a while only to find a better version of it about 20 minutes later, I stopped altogether. I also engaged in outposts very briefly because they're not my cup of tea, but from what I see online, it requires a lot of skill investment and similarly a desire to do so, since your rewards are money and materials for modding and more building. I'm happy this exists for the people that enjoy it, and I'm also very happy that it isn't required. How useful it is beyond your own personal enjoyment in doing it is affected by some problems with the economy that I will touch on later. The biggest issue with this skill system is the fact that to continue leveling up, you not only need the skill point, but to clear a requirement from the previous rank of a skill. For example, to continue putting points in the rifle skill, you must defeat enemies with rifles. I have no issue with this system in concept. It's actually fun to chase numbers and make bars go up, we all know that, but its balancing doesn't seem well tuned. Killing 200 enemies with rifles is a much easier proposal than destroying 30 enemy ships or lockpicking 30 times. As in, 200 enemies with rifles might be one quest, and you might destroy less than 30 enemy ships during 3 main quest lines. If I'm prioritizing a skill, limiting some of them like this is just annoying. In theory, it should happen organically as you play, but if I apply that logic to lockpicking, it would have taken 20 hours to get those 30 instances. I had to actively seek them out to make it faster, and all the while, if I don't do it and level it up, I'm locked out of lockpicking in higher tiers. And something like lockpicking is not only very time consuming, but also uses resources that you have to carefully search for or make sure to purchase every time you stop at a vendor in DigiPix. Another issue is that if you ever forget to level something up, you might be missing out on completing the requirements for it, even if you're doing it. Sure, maybe I'm dumb for forgetting, I accept this, but the game could remind me with a, hey, you could be unlocking your next rank of piloting right now since you just took out a ship. That wouldn't annoy me more than my companion screaming, I'd like to talk to you if you have a moment, after every single conversation I have during a super tense main quest where everything is on fire. I mention it because it happened to me. I thought I was unlocking piloting by destroying ships, but I wasn't. I forgot to get that next tier, and after a massive star battle, I noticed it. Hunting down ships to destroy so that you can get your next piloting skill is slow and time consuming, so I felt like I missed out. And I instead ended up grinding it out at the combat simulator, which is boring, repetitive, and where you don't use your cool ship and instead use the one that you're given. Another problem with the game that I debated on talking about, because I'm sure that it will be fixed down the line, maybe, who knows, is its performance. Starfield's performance is abysmal. I ran the game on an i9-13900K, an RTX 4090, on a 7000 megabyte speed SSD with 64 gigs of RAM. I played in ultra-wide 21:9 at 1440p. The game struggled to maintain a consistent frame rate above 60 FPS in many different areas, and by no means got close to the 120 FPS I expected it to. I had dips into the low 50s, with calmer, emptier areas hitting just below 90 FPS. A level of variance that nobody should be comfortable with, and all of this while using AMD FSR 2. Installing NVIDIA DLSS with frame generation boosted my FPS to a minimum of around 70 FPS, much more tolerable, and upwards of 110 in some areas, but this required, once again, help from modders, because Bethesda will be implementing DLSS later on. Let's be honest, this game does not impress graphically. While I enjoy how it looks, on a technical level, Starfield isn't pushing ray tracing or cutting-edge effects or massive textures. And while its gameplay is complex, it's only complex for the engine it's running on. A video game that looks like this and plays like this should not run like this on the most expensive hardware you can buy right now. I don't know how the game performs on Xbox, but I can imagine that it's functional, although locked at 30 FPS. None of this is acceptable. Jace2 Sensei PC Build channel mentioned that it is the new Crysis, in reference to the video game titled Crysis, an age-old meme of benchmarking computers with that game. The difference is that when Crysis launched, nothing looked as good as Crysis. When Starfield launched, there's a chance there's modded versions of Skyrim that look better. When it comes to its writing and story, Starfield makes some interesting changes compared to previous Bethesda games. I would say the overall quality of the writing is better, and I found myself laughing often, but there are some real stinkers in there as well. Writing and story are very subjective, and for me, I enjoyed the main quest and thought it was well done, but a really slow burn where it took a while for me to even like the main characters. I also want to mention how much dialogue is in the game, which is a number I've seen floating around. I'm sure that that amount of dialogue is true, but it's also true that a lot of the dialogue in this game isn't from it having an insane amount of quests to do. A lot of it is considering many different options, which is very good. It doesn't matter which of your 4 companions you have with you, they almost always have something to say in any of the main quest lines. They also have very long conversations about the decisions you make in each of those quest lines at different stages in them. And also there's a lot of dialogue that is just funny options, just funny non sequiturs that are there to add flavor. Some of it is great and some of it falls very flat. A lot of the quests in the game can also be circumvented with money. This isn't new, this happens in many RPGs. Well, you can pay me, or if you don't have the money, do this favor for me. The problem is the economy of the game, because money is not hard to come by. Even selling a couple of guns, looting here and there, or moving some contraband, which is not difficult at all, it's simply remembering that you have it and taking a slight detour before heading to a major city, all provide you with a ton of credits. Without investing into commerce skills at all, by the way. Most quests that feature the option to skip steps for money will ask for anywhere between 1,000 to 3,000 credits, with the highest I saw being 10,000. For context, without much effort, I had over 1 million credits in my playthrough. Why would I ever consider doing those alternatives? Of course, if you want to explore the questline and other potential benefits, see if there's any content behind doing those favors and meeting other characters or whatever may happen, you will take it anyways. But when I did them early on, it amounted to little more than some extra combat or some running around for a fetch quest. It doesn't make sense to me that someone with 1 million credits wouldn't simply pay these small fees to expedite the process. It would make me feel stupid to go run errands for some bartender to save 2,000 credits with 1 million in my wallet. And this makes me think that the economy is not very well adjusted or balanced. When we start pairing the lack of motivation or need for loot and money, especially as the game goes on, a very different issue appears. While some quests are just entertaining and others are very compelling, many are simply boring. I recently did a video speaking on some of my favorite things present in Baldur's Gate 3, and one of the many things that I found very smart about it was how it makes you want to engage with its quests. In Baldur's Gate 3, many of your side quests present you with situations that either directly affect your companions or affect the main questline. You're shown early on that these side quests have tangible impact on different characters, and their outcomes will be felt in a meaningful way later down the line. This meant that for me, engaging in quests in Baldur's Gate 3 was always a reward in itself. I wanted to resolve these conflicts because the game wrote them in a way that from the very start, they made them important to my character. This rarely happens in Starfield. Early on, you might be motivated instead by the rewards of the quests present. A new weapon, a new ship, shiny armor. But as those things matter less and less, you lose any incentive to participate in some of these quests. The exception is the Crimson Fleet questline, which is cleverly introduced by holding a crime over your character's head, and then you're forced to work for the government. Nothing else tries to really hook you into a questline like that one does, although for the sake of the player's freedom, you're never forced to continue it. Starfield doesn't look to put hooks into quests and make them interesting to you. Instead of that, Starfield presents you with options. Hey, while you're here, why don't you become a member of the United Colonies Vanguard? But it never ties that into the story or makes it intriguing as something that will offer you or your companions an advantage in your main pursuit, or that will open up something new about the world or give you more knowledge. This line of thought led me back, once again, to Bethesda's previous outings, and I was surprised to discover that this isn't the case in all of their games. Skyrim very much falls under this sandbox exploration approach, where you have a main quest that is relatively vague, and much of the side activities have absolutely nothing to do with it. You engage in them because you can, and you want to explore them without any other motivation than that. But Fallout 3 and 4, and even more so in New Vegas, but that's an Obsidian game, so I try not to talk about it, do a good job of making a lot of the quests tie into the central conflict. They present characters that are invested in the larger story and can even become companions. They offer lore and perspective on the world that help you understand it and inform your decisions in the more defining moments of your adventure. Or they present a self-contained mystery that still feels meaningful within the context of the world and its conflicts. Heck, even just hearing rumors on the radio makes many of the quests feel more impactful in the world, like they're legends that people speak about or situations that are interesting and relevant, making you seek them out just to experience those locations or conflicts firsthand. Starfield doesn't do this. Most of the time, Starfield expects you to be interested in a questline because it exists, because it's content that you can do, as if that is enough motivation for the player to explore it. And for many, that might work, but I believe that good quest design and good writing should make players want to participate because they care about what is happening and want to have an impact on the outcome. Whatever tricks might be necessary to make the player care are welcome. Tie it into the main quest, hold a carrot on a stick, tease its importance, its relevance, or its potential effect on events to come later. But Starfield feels like it isn't interested in this. It's happy placing a sign, like a roller coaster at an amusement park, and saying, here's the ride, come ride it if you want. And if you feel like riding it, you get on, but you know that there's no further consequences and no reason for getting on beyond the fact that you felt like it. That isn't the case, by the way, at least that last part. While most quests are indeed these roller coaster signs, once you get on, they do world building and open up interesting questions and mysteries, but you feel like it's a gamble on if they will. You can bet on the main faction questlines doing so, even if they don't ever lure you in with that promise. Again, they don't lure you in at all, they just kind of exist there. And the main storyline, which I'll get a little bit deeper into later on, doesn't really help, because the main idea behind it is explore the galaxy, and I've already explained how unattractive that can be. I think it wouldn't be that difficult to add these intrinsic hooks into these quests, at least for the main faction quests. It would be enough to tie it into the main quest with a little something extra, like a situation in an early quest that shows you that UC citizens have an easier time traveling and accessing planets in that system, and the same could be applied to the Freestar Collective and the Crimson Fleet. And if the player character then went out seeking those advantages, it would allow you to bypass certain requirements and quests in spaces controlled by the factions. More interestingly, you could have dialogue options where your character expresses that they don't know much about a certain thing, and maybe Sarah Morgan can recommend that you go visit the UC Museum. And from there, it would feel very natural to get roped into the situation with the United Colonies Vanguard. I don't know. Give me a gentle nudge, something that makes these quests tie in better than simply doing them because they're there. Ideally, do it narratively. I'm not a game designer. I'm just a person who likes games and talking about them, and I want them to be the best they can be. So I don't have answers to all the problems I point out, but I know how to spot those problems and hopefully do a good job of expressing how they make me feel and how they negatively impacted my time with the game. When examining all of these things, all of the ideas that are crammed into Starfield, it makes me believe that the ambitions are all in the right place, but they can't be fulfilled with the scope the game sets for itself, and the limitations of its engine. So allow me to paint a picture. A different version of Starfield. One with a handful of different systems, let's say 6 or 7. They're all together with a disproportionate amount of inhabitable planets. Fix up some of that robotic NPC nature. Fix the combat, specifically the artificial intelligence. Heck, you can even leave some of the glitches. Make only certain areas of the planets explorable. Place invisible barriers and designated landing zones, but all of the content in them should be handcrafted in the same way that old Bethesda games have. And cram all the content in Starfield into this new map. Make space travel and landing seamless, and reduce the number of loading screens. I'm not saying eliminate them, once again, just reduce it. And then leave some of the positives I'm going to mention in a minute. I'm convinced that by doing this, while people would still whine about the number of planets or how it's not realistic or it has invisible barriers, it would still be considered one of the best games ever made. A game that would truly evolve on the promises of Bethesda's very unique brand of RPG, but pumps up the scale, the diversity, the amount of content, instead of a game that evolves in ways that barely matter and has to make significant compromises in its design to even achieve that. The very idea of Starfield goes against why I play Bethesda games. And while I can still enjoy a lot about the game, and I think it's a no-brainer to try it on Game Pass if you have it, the combination of its premise and its engine strips away so much of the soul of their games that it doesn't have any of the impact anymore. But as I said before, there's still some good to talk about. Combat and movement has been improved from Fallout 4, and shooting guns feels good. That's it. That's all. It just feels good. That's all I have to say about that. The art style, while subjective, is something I love. The general aesthetic choices and the amount of love and care put into all of the assets is palpable. Each handcrafted location feels purposeful, with an attention to detail in its design for both exploration and combat purposes, while also remaining believable spaces. While it isn't always magnificent, it hits more than it doesn't. And some of these locations are amazing to look at and fun to explore and fight in. If only the enemies had functioning brains, just this part of the game would be enough to carry it. I will say I enjoyed the visuals more with the Natural LUTs mod installed because it took away some of the aggressive filtering for more natural colors. But that doesn't change my opinion that even with the standard filter, the game looks great from an aesthetic perspective, even if it doesn't graphically. The game also addresses one of my and many people's main complaints about other Bethesda games, namely Skyrim. And this is about how the faction quests play out. You don't end up being the supreme leader and commander of the faction, only to then not be recognized by any NPC for what you are. Instead, you become a member, sometimes high-ranking of these organizations, and I encountered many opportunities where my status obtained from these faction quests was useful in others. Being a Freestar Ranger gave me multiple persuasion checks during the UC Vanguard questline, where I could state I was a ranger. granting me instant access to things that make sense given that. This is a big step up, and impressive when considering how many different quests are in the game, that these things have been taken into account and lead to satisfying results when it comes to roleplay. One of my most surprising positives is how the game convinces you that you are in space. Given the fact that there are no seamless transitions when you enter a space station or board a ship or land on a planet, small details still pull you into believing that this universe is cohesive and makes sense. It's not until you look at the reasons why the game is how it is that you realize, and I'm sorry if this ruins the experience for you, everything is just boxes connected by loading screens. There is no continuity in anything. These are all just separate maps that you load into, disconnected from each other. But I think it's a testament to how good of a job the art and world design are, that these massive complex spaces feel believable as different planets and cities all configured in very different ways. I also admire Bethesda's decision to respect criticism of Fallout 4 and revert back to a mute protagonist. The complaints of tone and delivery not matching the player's expectations when choosing dialogue in Fallout 4 seem to have been taken into consideration, as I felt that all my dialogue choices had the intended effect, and I was never caught off guard by the reaction of others to my choices. This sounds like the bare minimum for these sorts of games, but this isn't easy to pull off, and a major show of skill in writing. It's one of those things that you only notice when it's bad. When it's excellent, you just proceed as normal. But I want to mention it here because this is a really big step up and a really good job in general. The world building and lore is well done. There is a great sense of history and place that shows careful consideration, something hard to do for a world this big and on a first attempt. Games like Elder Scrolls and Fallout have had years and iteration after iteration to flesh out every detail, and even then they stumble into plot holes. I have no doubt that these exist in Starfield as well, but I felt like the world setup was done very, very well. Not with the condition of it being a first attempt. Just well done, full stop. The pulpy sci-fi Star Wars leading universe is fun, exciting, not overly self-serious, and managed to feel unique within the broader sci-fi setups I've seen, despite it being such a popular setting. The basic factions and their setups are interesting along with their history. The conflict between the Freestar Collective and the United Colonies was an interesting thing to explore and felt unique despite boiling down to government space marines versus space cowboys. That sounds so dumb when you say it out loud, but it really didn't require that much effort on my part to suspend disbelief. The obviously cyberpunk-inspired city of Neon has a moodiness and a history that is well explained and makes sense in the world, as do the way that the Crimson Fleet's space pirating affairs do, with that extra wrinkle that those space pirates are essentially obsessed with lost pirate treasure. This all sounds so childish and simple on the surface. Like a bunch of different tropes were all thrown into one setting. You got space marines, cowboys, pirates, and cyberpunk dystopian capitalism espionage. It just sounds like four things that shouldn't blend together, but somehow it all made sense and they were enjoyable in their own right. They didn't clash for me when put together. And Constellation, as the pure-hearted space explorers right in the middle, the ragtag group of misfits that will solve the universe's biggest mystery, worked really well for me as the main questline. And while I wouldn't classify anything here as transcendental storytelling that had me on the edge of my seat, it was all very fun. House Varun as the missing piece of the puzzle, explored only on the fringes of the story, felt like a disappointment, however. I think that their premise is interesting as all get out in how wacky it sounds. A religious space cult that worships a space serpent sounds like something out of Dead Space, and I would have loved them as a stand-in for the Dark Brotherhood's twisted, zany questlines. But they are sadly absent and only teased, no doubt for a future DLC. I would have loved to interact with them and see their main city, and before I found out they weren't in the game, they were the faction I was most excited about when hearing all about the history of the Settle systems and the interactions of the Freestar, the United Colonies, and the Varun. And that realization that House Varun wouldn't be explored further, that sinking feeling that the things I wanted most out of Starfield wouldn't be delivered, repeated the more I played. Like walking into a lake without knowledge of how deep the water could be. I kept taking steps inwards, only to sink deeper and deeper until I wasn't walking. I was drowning. I have not been shy in expressing elsewhere that I found my initial hours with Starfield to be magical. I loved jumping back into a Bethesda world, a particular type of RPG that only they seem to even attempt to make. I had heard many people say that the game only gets better as you keep playing. And while that may be true for the initially slow and overwhelming hours, there is a point that I think everyone will reach later on. A point where the inherent flaws in its design will start to drown you as well. Exploring systems looking for that same sense of exploration is frustrating and can't be compensated with the very rare amazing discovery, which is still hampered by the fact that the discovery came from clicking through a menu. You will go through a stretch of enjoying world exploration and surveying planets until you stumble upon a repeated structure one too many times. You will enjoy the combat until the AI, or the lack of difficulty, makes it feel superfluous. You will enjoy the world and the lore until you find out that the part that you find the most interesting isn't actually explored in the game. This is death by 1,000 cuts. Drowning by 1,000 steps. I do want to mention the main quest briefly. I'm not going to go into detail on any of the stories because the game is still very new, and I'm sure there are people interested in experiencing these things. I also won't mention the 2 or 3 completely hidden quest lines that exist out there, but be assured that some of them still exist. The main quest progresses much as you might expect from the start. You join Constellation, you explore the galaxy, obtain artifacts, get space powers. The first big twist happens at the quest, A High Price to Pay. This takes some additional twists and introduces the real conflict you'll deal with when reaching the end of the campaign. This quest in particular, by the way, has some of the hardest hitting story revelations while being horrible in its gameplay. It includes fast traveling from the Lodge to the Eye many times, which makes you fly into space, dock onto the Eye, do like 2 things, go back to your ship, undock, and head back down. And at one point, a fight ensues through the city of New Atlantis with some very bullet-spongy enemies that show how simple and bad the combat can be. And also some immersion-breaking moments where guards will help you shoot down your enemies and immediately transition to their normal dialogue, the new equivalent of "I used to be an adventurer until I got an arrow in the knee" type of thing. It also recycles a version of the New Atlantis map that is also used in the UC Vanguard questline, so whatever. The point is that from here, it's a rapid approach towards the end of the game, and towards New Game Plus, which you've already deciphered what it will be if you're at this stage in the story. New Game Plus comes with a whole other host of things, and on one hand, it's a more interesting way to present this concept. And on another hand, it's a very strange thing to exist that leaves open way too many questions about the world and doesn't explain the philosophical and religious themes it initially explores. But again, while I could say more on the subject, I want people interested to explore this for themselves. The main story has some great moments. From a quest design perspective, it's the most solid main quest Bethesda has ever put out. There are some great quests, with the highs of things like Entangled being very high, and the lows are still kind of okay or balanced out in the end. Ultimately, my disappointment with Starfield comes from it being so close to amazing and falling flat on so many different things. This might sound impossible with how much I've complained about different things in the game, but the truth is that if this game were thought out from the start just a little bit differently, many of these would be fixed. I do ultimately blame the Creation Engine 2.0, which seems to be a black hole of absorbing development time and resources without putting out the results they would like. I recommend looking into the engine, and speedrunning videos are a great source of explanations for how it works as well, and that way you might see how this engine affects the design of this game. But like I said, I don't think this game is bad. I don't think it's lazy or uninspired. I think that it can be a very fun video game for a good wealth of hours, and it definitely has something that many people will love. But it is a very flawed game. It's the fact that it loses so much of the essence that these games have that makes me enjoy it less than its predecessors. If you simply rate Starfield on what it is, which is a series of quest hubs, 5 primary quest lines with some decent role-playing, some overall good writing, a looter shooter which also has ship combat and customization, outpost building, and apartment decorating. It does all of these things well enough, and at a quality level that will entertain people. Some more thoroughly than others. And it will do so for a long stretch of hours, and for many people, especially with mods, for hundreds. You will enjoy the 5 stories that the game presents you, and the decisions you make. You will find the side stories vary in quality, but can be entertaining as well. You will find the shooting good enough, but incredibly simple, due to its bad AI. You'll love your ship, and all of its customizable spaces. But I don't think you can fall in love with this game in the same way that you can with its predecessors. It's missing so many pieces where the clear passion and ambition that the team put into it is thwarted by the reality of its engine, the technology, and the man-hours. It often feels like the tremendous resources poured into it were misplaced into a game that has a poor design at its foundation. Starfield is ultimately so concentrated on making this galaxy possible that they never asked what would be necessary to make people actually want to be in it. Well, hey, I'm Mugthief, and that was my review of Starfield. If you enjoyed this video, I ask you to please consider subscribing to the channel. I cover news, I do impressions, and I also do videos like this one. I would also love it if you could press the like button and leave a comment, because those things help this video reach more people. And after the amount of effort I put into it, that would really make my day. I don't like being negative, but Starfield truly did just make me very sad by the end of my experience with it, and I wanted to express it. I don't want to join the bandwagoning against Starfield, and I hope that is clear in this video. I really do want to look at what problems it has, and these are the ones I think matter the most. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.